We're pleased to welcome back to the show Bill Fletcher Jr., a labor activist and author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions and Solidarity Divided, as well as the owner of one of the most spot on quotes about capitalism and right wing populism that I've ever heard, of which I'm really excited to discuss today. But first, I do want to say thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. I'm really glad to be back. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, yeah, the pleasure's always ours. So I do want you to break us down for us. Your quote on right wing populism being the herpes of capitalism. Essentially, you can feel free to give the more fleshed out version if you want. But what is right wing populism, and in what ways is it the herpes of capitalism?
Yeah, well, thank you. So right-wing populism is not an ideology, it's an orientation. So let's start with the word populism. So populism is a set of politics that basically says that the world is divided between the people and an elite. And it doesn't go any deeper than that. That's basically what is. And then it also generally is associated with a strong leader. Um, Now, right wing populism, which needs to be understood as a term in and of itself, bracketed, like thinking mathematically, it's right wing populism with brackets around it. It's not right wing plus populism. Right wing populism is a set of political ideas and practices that basically says that it is the people against an elite, but it tends to identify the people ethnically, racially, or religiously, and the elite the same way. So it's not a class analysis. That's the important thing for people to understand. Sometimes people get confused because they think, well, it's the rich against the poor or this or that. It's not a class analysis. It's an identification of the people, usually with ethno-nationalist or religious tendencies.
Mhm.
So there's a long history to this in the United States, and it's a global phenomenon. But in the United States, it's usually associated with President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s and his railing against so-called elites on behalf of white men. And that's really important because this man was carrying out genocide against the Native Americans, and he was carrying out supporting slavery against Africans. He was a male supremacist, but he positioned himself as the voice of the people. And right wing populism has evolved ever since. Now, in my quote, right wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. What I'm getting at, Brandon, is this: that as long as you have capitalism, there will be right wing populism.
Mhm.
And it's going to be like an illness in the system. And it's there at a different point it manifests itself. And as in the case of herpes, when the system is weakened, it tends to manifest itself. So when there are economic crises, for instance, when there are large waves of immigrants,
Mhm.
that's when you tend to see right-wing populism merge and manifest itself and different symptoms. And then when you have financial crises, that's when you see a particular manifestation of it in the form of anti-Semitism. That when there are financial crises, the right wing goes Jew hunting and they start looking for Jews as allegedly being behind the crisis. So right wing populism is fundamentally different from left populism, the left populism of people like Bernie Sanders or AOC, that situates the people versus the elites in more class terms. And it's not in terms of ethnicity religion, etc. And it's not about region either.
Yeah, that was one of the more, I guess, eye-opening things because I've always struggled with online, especially seeing right-wingers spreading kind of like, oh, we're anti-establishment, or kind of adopting the rhetoric that you hear in these more left populist movements,
Right.
where I'm like, what is this? What are they getting at? And then when you said, obviously it's more like cultural, that it's more like the end root would be like anti-Semitism and these things, it kind of clicked to me because that's kind of where you see like they'll have problems with like Mark Zuckerberg, George Soros, but not like Elon Musk and Vivek
Right.
Ramaswamy or things like that. Could you speak to, because one of the more things that are interesting parts I saw you indulge in also was how they largely use the language of the left, things like
Mhm.
anti-establishment and things like that to kind of co-opt those parts of the movement. Could you speak more to that also?
Yeah. So what they do is that they'll take certain terms and they alter the meaning in some cases, or they give a different political meaning or political implication. Give you a couple of examples. One you mentioned about establishment. I'll come back to that in a second. The term cosmopolitan,
Mhm.
that has a long history. And so there is a literal definition that you can just look up. But for the right, cosmopolitan is usually associated with Jews. It's a code word for Jews. So, particularly in the post-Nazi period, post-World War II, when open anti-Semitism was frowned on, there were terms that could be used, they could be substituted, and everybody would know what they meant, but you weren't quite saying it.
Mhm.
Um, establishment, East Coast elites, right? Terms like that have a certain appeal. So the establishment is, as you said, it's a term that we on the left have used for a long time. But what the right means by the establishment, largely in religious and racial ways, in a certain respect, but they're looking at the establishment not in terms of the establishment of a class system. They're looking at the establishment as more like Andrew Jackson looking at the old line rich. Let me break it down in a different way, man. So, our vice president elect is associated with, I'm talking about Vance, associated with anti elitism.
Yep.
But when you listen to him and you listen to his story, what becomes clear is that he's not anti elitist. He's upset that he wasn't included in the elite. So if you look at his stories about what happened in school, his response to when his book, Hillbilly Elegy, was made into a film and a lot of people didn't like it, it wasn't that he was angry that an elite existed.
Mhm.
It was that he wants to be in it. And what happens over time is that these right wingers seek to displace existing elites with new elites. That's what the Nazis tried to do, right? To displace the old elites with new ones. And in fact, when the Nazi Party was rising, there was a whole theory of the national revolution. That's what they called it, which was not anti-capitalist. It was basically against the Jews and against the old line wealthy. But they weren't trying to get rid of the capitalist system. And so when the right uses the term anti-establishment, they don't mean it in the way that we on the left do. They basically mean replacing the existing establishment, whether they use religious terms or not, with a new one.
Yep.
And that's what we have to be very, very careful about. Now, one of the things that is related to this is that sometimes this kind of anti elitism has appeal for those that, in general, whatever, usually in the middle strata economically, have felt crushed
Mhm.
between the wealthy and the poor, and it felt like they've never really had the opportunity to become wealthy. Not an opportunity to live a good life, but they have missed the opportunity to become wealthy, and they're very resentful. And it makes them susceptible to the messages of right-wing populism and fascism.
I completely agree. And the way that I've been looking at it is because it's more cultural rather than economic or class wise in their sense. They don't really care about getting rid of the establishment in that, the establishment stands to protect private capital and interest. They just want to make sure it's controlled by straight white males. And, if they're conservative, that surely helps as well. Where do you think those of us on the left, specifically, with the focus on left-wing populism, should place our focus when trying to combat this sort of apparatus it seems the right has built with pushing their more misinformation, this kind of right-wing populist agenda? Like, where should we focus in pushing back against that?
It's a very big question. So let me start by clarifying something.
Mhm.
This may sound semantical. Um, the battle we're engaging around right-wing populism is often described as cultural wars, but they're not culture. They're not about culture. They're about democracy or the lack thereof. So if you look at what the right-wing populists are articulating, the suppression of women, the extermination of LGBTQ people, the establishment of, in effect, a neo-apartheid state. These aren't cultural issues. These are about democracy. And this is the accordion-like struggle that exists within capitalism between expanding democracy and compressing democracy. So right-wing populism, even when it argues that it's for greater democracy, actually isn't. It's for suppressing democracy, limiting the right to vote. In our case in the country, challenging the 14th Amendment, um, ethnic cleansing, etc., in the name of allegedly enfranchising the legitimate population. Because you see, that's the key thing in understanding right-wing populism, is that for right-wing populism, there's a legitimate population and an illegitimate population. So for instance, a friend of mine was telling me about a ride he had in a cab back in 2020 after the election, presidential election. And the cab driver said, Trump won. And my friend said, there's no facts to back that up, right? And and the cab driver said something like, but there were all these people who voted that should never have voted.
Mhm.
Now, what that person meant becomes obvious when you start hearing it more broadly. They're not really talking about people who are illegal. They're talking about people that they do not think should have the franchise.
Yeah.
That's the critical thing. Okay, now going to back very directly to your question. Um, there's a number of things that we're going to have to do to fight right-wing populism and fascism. First, uh, those of us who are anti-fascist, whether objectively or subjectively, need to be much clearer in our understanding of the nature of right-wing populism and fascism. And so that means in the organizations that we're participating in, I'm talking about people's organizations, mass organizations, we need to make sure that there's education programs on understanding the nature of the far right.
Mhm.
This becomes very, very important. We need to make sure that the leadership of these organizations understands this and is prepared to tackle the demagoguery of the far right. We need to engage in struggles around democracy. For example, around electoral disenfranchisement, around abortion rights, um, against book banning, all of these things. We've got to engage people in that so that they understand what is being moved against us. But we also have to engage in what I'll just call the media war. And so what has happened over the last 40 plus years is that far right forces, wealthy ones, have started buying up media. So media consolidation is not just simply that capitalists are consolidating it. It's also that there's a particular effort by right-wing capitalists to do this. AM radio, for example, where major players on the right have been buying up stations all around the country, and limits real free debate and expression. The closing of newspapers or the buying up of newspapers, and what that's meant. The control in social media, particularly Twitter and Facebook, right? We also have to be looking at publications that are not necessarily on the left, but are liberal to progressive and are threatened. I'm thinking about, for example, Black news media. Black newspapers. There's also this newly formed network of Black newspapers that's online called Word in Black. And we need to be promoting and pushing these out there. We need to also be prepared to debate in right-wing circles. And this is difficult because we have to train people. I've been in two settings, once on television, once on radio, by a right-wing outlet, which will go nameless. And I was ambushed both times. And it was really interesting because both times their tactic for getting me on was the same. They contacted me, they were very flattering, explaining to me what they wanted me to talk about. And then I got on, and in both cases, they ambushed me. They brought on a guest that they had not told me was going to be brought on. And in both cases, the guest was given more time and in order to articulate the position. And I was caught flat-footed. I was trying to be polite. I wasn't really trained on how to take these people on. And to borrow from a friend of mine, I didn't want the New York in me coming out, where I would express to them where they should go and at what rate of speed, and what to do when they got there. So we need to train people. What do you do if you go on any of these right-wing broadcasts? In the last election, Trump was willing to go on all kinds of programs, and Harris less so. And Harris actually needed to go on some right-wing programs, fully prepared, knowing how to respond. So all of this is part of our counter assault on the right. The other thing that we have to do politically is undermine their strategies. So I'll give you an example in the current moment. The Achilles heel of the far right is the environment. The right wing has no solution to the environmental catastrophe we're living through, other than genocide. Really, that's their solution.
Or point fingers at Democrats.
I'm sorry?
Or they just point fingers at Democrats.
That was the other thing I was going to say. Exactly. Then they, just as they're doing in California right now, trying to blame politicians for a problem that was a result of human, specifically the capitalist impact on the environment. So what that I think means is that we need to better build the environmental justice movements as real, honest to goodness mass movements that are countering the far right and linking our arguments around the environment with our arguments, our essential arguments about the social safety net, which has been destroyed by neoliberals and by the far right. So when you have a situation like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Helene this past fall, the fires in California, the fires that we've seen, not just in California, but in Hawaii, in the absence of social safety net, which needs to be there to help people through these crises, which are going to increase until humanity is compelled to address them, there needs to be safety. There need to be steps that are taken. The right wing doesn't want to do that. And so we've got to be thinking strategically about how to move a counter assault against these folks and disrupt them. And there's plenty of other examples of things that we can be doing.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I want to again, I want to say thank you for coming on and sharing some knowledge about right-wing populism and how we can fight against it and building left-wing populism. I want to give you the chance if you have any like projects or anything you want to shout out quickly before we wrap, you can go ahead.
Sure, there's two things, a couple of things. So one of the things that I helped organize is something called Standing for Democracy. And I would encourage your viewers and listeners to look us up online. It's standing plus the number 4 democracy.org, which is an anti-fascist worker-focused project. We're very recently formed, early 2024, and aiming at countering the right in various ways. So that's one thing I would encourage. The second thing is that we've got to, if you're not in an organization, get in an organization and be prepared to fight back. That's critical. The third thing is we have to guard against something called anticipatory compliance. This is a term that someone invented relatively recently that basically argues that you see a pattern that often emerges when authoritarians are trying to come to power, where many people, particularly liberals, start caving in advance of the authoritarians taking over. And that's what I mean by anticipatory compliance, right? So they're expecting the right to take over and they're trying to rearrange themselves and their practice so that they can exist under this authoritarian system. So, for instance, the Washington Post and the LA Times refusing to endorse a candidate before the election. The LA Times owner telling the editorial board that they cannot write an editorial critical of Trump's cabinet appointments. Zuckerberg's complete retreat from diverse equity and inclusion projects. All of this is anticipatory compliance, and we have to fight against that. And those organizations and companies that stand firm, we need to be supporting them, right? And saying, no, they are doing the right thing. It's people like Zuckerberg that are being cowardly and are backing down. This happens, and you can see this historically. So these are a few things that people should all keep in mind as we go forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's something I've tried to push on my channel as well. That's like these are like the steps of how fascism gets instituted. You destroy the credibility in institutions, institutions capitulate to all your demands, and then you control the narratives and all of those things. But yeah, again,
Right.
thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I'll definitely have the link to that organization you mentioned in the description if
Thank you.
anyone wants to check it out. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Keep fighting the good fight, my friend.
All right, you too. Thanks a lot.